I am going to tell you a story about the most expensive, humiliating, and ultimately fortunate mistake ever made by a proud English nobleman. It happened on a freezing October morning in the year 1851, right on the sprawling timber dock of the Ironwood estate. That was the precise moment when the Duke of Ashbourne stepped down from his carriage, looked directly at the wealthiest woman in the Scottish Highlands, and ordered her to carry his luggage. But it would take him the better part of 3 weeks to understand what he had done, with a profound and indescribable amount of mortification in between. His name was Julian Vance, the Duke of Ashbourne, and he had been violently jostled in a hired, rattling coach for 2 grueling days, simply to court an heiress he had never once met. Julian rested his head against the wooden wall of the carriage. The dry dust of the road mixed with the damp, mildewed scent of the frayed velvet cushions, filling his lungs with every breath. The biting autumn cold of the Highlands slipped right through his heavy wool greatcoat, settling deep into his bones. But the freezing air outside was absolutely nothing compared to the sickening dread twisting in his stomach. He was hunting for a fortune. Only a few short months ago, Julian had stood in his gloomy, echoing study at Ashbourne Hall, his ancient ancestral seat in Cornwall. It had been 6 years since his father's death. The late Duke had left his eldest son a magnificent, exalted title, a grand estate, and a colossal, suffocating mountain of debt. Julian had done absolutely everything in his power. He had sold off the priceless family portraits. He had dismissed half the loyal servants. He had strapped on heavy leather boots and trudged through the mud to manage the tenant farms himself. But the desperate, exhausting labor of one man could not possibly fill the massive financial crater left by generations of reckless aristocratic waste. The cold, monotonous voice of his family solicitor still echoed in his mind. "Your Grace, you must marry a woman of substantial wealth. It is the only path to survival." It was a cruel and profoundly humiliating truth. Back home, his aging mother sat knitting by a hearth where she had quietly ordered the servants to burn less coal each night. His younger brother required tuition. His 2 young sisters, barely 19 and 20, desperately needed respectable dowries so they would not be shunned by polite society. None of them ever complained, but the silent, crushing weight of their quiet sacrifices broke his shoulders. And so, here he was, a proud duke preparing to play the role of a devoted suitor. His target was Lady Beatrice Thorne, 32 years old, the sole, independent owner of a vast timber empire. Julian would have to smile. He would have to be attentive. He would have to offer sweet, calculated lies. He would have to look at her across the breakfast table every single morning for the rest of his natural life, hiding a false, hollow heart. Having to write the script for his own betrayal made him feel entirely breathless. The carriage suddenly banked around a sharp coastal curve. The heavy, gray morning fog began to lift. The Ironwood estate stood magnificently against the skyline. The grand glass windows on the second floor caught the early morning sun, reflecting the light like sheets of polished copper. Closer to the water, the massive timber dock stretched far out into the churning, slate-colored sea. The sharp scent of freshly cut pine, raw tree sap, and biting sea salt saturated the air. The carriage rolled to a complete halt. Julian stepped down, carefully brushing the wrinkles from his heavy coat. He immediately wrapped himself in his usual, unshakable aristocratic authority. His dark eyes swept across the bustling dock. Sturdy, broad-shouldered laborers hurried back and forth, carrying massive logs. They moved with a practiced rhythm, carefully sidestepping a single woman who was crouching right in the middle of the busy thoroughfare. She wore a coarse, unadorned gray dress and a heavy, durable canvas apron. Her dark hair was pinned up tightly beneath a practical wool cap to block the harsh sea wind. She was balancing a massive leather-bound ledger on her knee, her brow furrowed in deep concentration as she studied a complex page of numbers. Julian Vance did not pay close attention. He merely gave her the brief, passing glance of a tired, travel-worn nobleman who was entirely accustomed to categorizing people the very second he saw them. A bookkeeper, a low-level clerk, a woman of the working sort who had a head for figures. Julian strode confidently across the timber dock. His leather boot heels struck the wooden planks with a sharp, commanding rhythm. It was the purposeful stride of a man who had absolute authority. "You there," Julian called out. His voice was not harsh, nor was it openly mocking. It simply carried the absolute certainty of a man who was used to looking down from a very great height. "I am the Duke of Ashbourne. I have come to call upon Lady Thorne. I believe she is expecting me. Be a good girl and go inside to announce that I have arrived, and have someone fetch my luggage." The woman in the canvas apron stopped her pencil. She slowly looked up from her ledger. Her eyes were a striking, vivid emerald green, perfectly calm and piercingly sharp. A fresh smear of sticky pine resin marked the back of her left hand. She stared up at him in absolute silence for a long, heavy moment. It was not the fearful, submissive look of a servant. It was the quiet, calculating assessment of someone who had just been handed a remarkably interesting problem. "Of course, Your Grace," she said softly. Her voice was clear and perfectly even. "I will see to it directly. And now, I am going to stop our story right here in this frozen, breathless moment." Because the proud, arrogant Duke, currently turning his back to walk toward his carriage, had absolutely no idea what he had just done. He did not know that he had just asked Beatrice Thorne to announce his arrival to herself, and she had simply smiled and agreed, deciding in that very instant to see exactly how terrible this man truly was, when he believed that no one of consequence was watching. The freezing, salt-laced wind off the Scottish loch whipped fiercely against Beatrice Thorne's canvas apron. She remained perfectly still on the wooden dock, her sharp, emerald eyes tracking the broad, tailored shoulders of the Duke of Ashbourne as he confidently walked away. He did not look back, not even once. To Julian Vance, she had instantly become part of the scenery. She was as insignificant as the wooden crates, the heavy iron mooring cleats, or the screeching seagulls circling overhead. Beatrice slowly closed her heavy leather ledger. A small, cold smile played at the corners of her mouth. She was 32 years old, and for the past 4 years, she had been the most relentlessly hunted woman in the whole of Britain. When her father, the formidable industrialist Arthur Thorne, had passed away, he had shocked the entire county. He did not divide the vast Ironwood estate among distant, incompetent male relatives. He did not place the sprawling timber empire into a restrictive trust to be managed by a board of directors. He had left every single penny, every acre of ancient pine forest, and every humming sawmill, directly and unconditionally to his only daughter. He had known she was the only one who truly understood the wood, the only one who could run the mills with both a ruthless mind and a careful heart. She had walked the harvest lines since she was 12 years old. She knew the seasonal rhythms of the tides and the dangerous log drives better than any man in the Highlands. But the very moment the will was read, the vultures had descended. The endless, exhausting parade of suitors had begun. Second sons with crippling gambling debts, smiling barons with collapsing roofs, impoverished earls armed with desperate, practiced charm and impeccable letters of introduction. Beatrice had endured 4 long, suffocating years of it. She had learned, with the weary certainty of long experience, to spot the exact, sickening moment when a gentleman's warm gaze drifted away from her face and locked hungrily onto the sprawling timber yards outside her drawing-room window. She had learned how their voices subtly changed when they asked about shipping contracts and revenue yields, the false warmth, the hollow, predatory compliments. It had not made her bitter. Beatrice was far too practical and honest for bitterness, but it had left a deep, freezing ache in her chest, a quiet, devastating certainty that she would never, ever know if a man was looking at her, or looking at her bank accounts. And then, the polite, formal letter from the Duke of Ashbourne had arrived. She had almost declined his visit. She had the rejection letter half written on her desk. She knew exactly what he was, just another desperate, titled aristocrat needing her merchant gold to patch his sinking ship. But then, he had stepped off his carriage. He had looked at a woman wearing a rough canvas apron, and he had ordered her to fetch his bags. A brilliant, dangerous spark ignited in Beatrice's mind. She tucked the heavy ledger tightly under her arm. She did not walk toward the carriage to announce herself. Instead, she turned on her heel and took the narrow, hidden path up the cliffside, slipping through the servants' entrance at the back of the grand Ironwood manor. She moved swiftly through the bustling kitchens. The comforting scent of roasting mutton and fresh bread filled the warm air, a stark contrast to the biting wind of the dock. She bypassed the busy cooks and summoned her most trusted staff into the private pantry. Mrs. Higgins, the formidable gray-haired housekeeper, and old Mr. Davies, the fiercely loyal dock foreman, stood before her. Beatrice looked at them both, her eyes gleaming with a reckless, unfamiliar excitement. "The Duke of Ashbourne is currently walking toward the front doors," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a sharp, conspiratorial whisper. "When he arrives, you will welcome him with the utmost courtesy. You will show him to the finest guest chambers. You will feed him well, but you will tell him that Lady Beatrice Thorne has been unavoidably called away to the northern logging camps." Mrs. Higgins blinked, her hands pausing on her starched white apron. "Called away, my lady? For how long?" "For several days," Beatrice answered smoothly. "Tell his grace that I am terribly sorry for the delay, but he is to treat Ironwood exactly as his own home until I return." Old Mr. Davies frowned, scratching his rough gray beard in confusion. "But you are here, Miss Beatrice. You are standing right in front of us." "No, I am not," Beatrice smiled. "For the next few days, Lady Thorne does not exist. I am nothing more than a ledger keeper, a lowly clerk who works in the timber office, and not a single soul in this household is to give me away." The two older servants stared at her in stunned silence. Slowly, the brilliant, wicked reality of her plan dawned on them. Mrs. Higgins's stern, wrinkled face cracked into a rare, delighted grin. Mr. Davies looked out the kitchen window toward the front drive and let out a low, rumbling chuckle of pure anticipation. "We understand perfectly, miss," the old foreman said, tapping the side of his nose. Beatrice stepped out into the shadowed hallway. She listened to the heavy brass knocker echoing against the grand mahogany front doors. She knew exactly what the Duke of Ashbourne was preparing to do. He was preparing to put on a magnificent performance. He was preparing to be charming, flawless, and utterly guarded. He would never reveal his true, calculating nature to a wealthy heiress. But no man bothers to wear his heavy, suffocating armor when he is speaking to the help. Beatrice leaned against the cool stone wall. She looked down at the sticky pine resin still clinging to her hand. "Very well, Your Grace," she whispered into the empty corridor. "Let us see exactly what kind of man you are, when you believe that absolutely no one of consequence is watching." Julian Vance did not sleep well. The guest chambers at Ironwood were undeniably magnificent. The bed was draped in heavy, embroidered velvet. The hearth was kept blazing by silent, efficient servants. But Julian spent the entire night staring up at the dark canopy, listening to the relentless crashing of the Cornish waves against the cliffs outside. He had braced himself for a battle. He had spent the entire journey meticulously preparing his performance. He had practiced his charming smiles, his polite inquiries, his carefully calculated compliments, and then he had been shown to his room, fed an exquisite dinner, and politely informed that Lady Beatrice Thorne was unavailable. He had been given time, empty, unstructured, suffocating time. Time to do absolutely nothing, but sit with his own crushing guilt and dread what was coming. By dawn, the quiet of the grand manor became unbearable. Julian dressed quickly, forgoing his formal cravat and heavy aristocratic coats. He pulled on a simple wool sweater and sturdy boots, stepping out into the freezing, salt-heavy morning air. He walked aimlessly away from the manicured lawns, drifting toward the deafening noise of the mill yard. The air here was entirely different. It smelled fiercely of fresh sawdust, crushed pine needles, and cold sea fog. Massive iron saws roared in the distance. Julian walked past towering stacks of raw timber, feeling entirely out of place. He was a duke, a man raised to govern estates and navigate drawing rooms, but here, among the dirt and the roaring machinery, his title meant absolutely nothing. To escape the biting coastal wind, he stepped toward a small, unassuming stone building at the edge of the yard. Faint yellow light spilled from a single glass window. On an impulse he could not quite explain, Julian pushed the heavy wooden door open. The sudden warmth of the room wrapped around him like a heavy blanket. The walls were paneled in rich, fragrant cedar. A small cast-iron stove hummed happily in the corner. And sitting at a wide oak table, entirely surrounded by towering stacks of contracts and shipping manifests, was the woman from the dock, the ledger clerk. She did not gasp. She did not immediately leap to her feet or curtsy with the frantic, trembling deference that Julian was so utterly accustomed to. She simply stopped her pencil, her striking emerald eyes looking up to meet his. Her dark hair was slightly messy this morning, a few loose strands escaping her practical wool cap. She had a smudge of dark ink on her thumb, and the expression of someone who had been interrupted mid-calculation, but was consciously choosing to be polite about it. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said softly, her voice carried over the crackle of the stove. "You keep remarkably early hours." Julian stood frozen in the doorway. He suddenly felt entirely foolish, like a trespasser in a world he did not understand. "I sleep poorly," Julian answered, his voice rougher and quieter than he intended. He had not meant to say that. He had not meant to say anything at all. "I beg your pardon. I did not mean to intrude on your work." Beatrice looked at him for a long moment. She saw the dark shadows under his eyes. She saw the heavy, unspoken exhaustion weighing down his broad shoulders. He did not look like a proud, predatory fortune hunter this morning. He looked like a man who was quietly carrying the weight of the world. "You are not intruding," Beatrice said smoothly, turning her attention back to the open ledger. She did not offer him a seat. She did not fuss over him. She simply gestured with the feathered end of her pen. "There is fresh coffee on the stove, if the coastal wind has chilled you." Julian blinked. There was something in her manner, a calm, unflinching directness, that he did not quite know what to do with. She spoke to him as one ordinary person speaks to another. There was absolutely no performance of smallness, no calculated flattery. She simply got on with her work and left him to get on with whatever he chose to do. Julian slowly closed the door behind him, shutting out the roaring noise of the mill yard. He walked over to the iron stove, poured himself a cup of dark, bitter coffee, and leaned quietly against the warm cedar wall. He stood there in absolute silence, sipping the hot liquid, watching the steady, rhythmic scratch of her pen against the thick paper. He could not explain it, but in that small, dusty room, listening to a nameless clerk balance her accounts, the heavy, suffocating stone in Julian's chest grew fractionally lighter, because for the first time since he left London, he did not have to pretend to be anything at all. Julian Vance returned to the cedar-paneled office the very next morning, and the morning after that. Beatrice Thorne was ready for him. She sat behind her heavy ledger, her sharp mind prepared to dissect a fortune hunter. She fully expected him to complain about the bitter Highland cold. She expected him to whine about the absent Lady Thorne, or perhaps boast about his grand estates in Cornwall to impress the lowly clerk. But Julian did none of those things. Instead, he stood quietly by the iron stove, watching the gray rain lash against the small glass window. He did not pry into her personal life. He simply asked about the timber. "This is old-growth pine," Julian noted, running his bare hand over a raw, unfinished plank resting near the door. "Incredibly dense grain. It takes a truly harsh, unforgiving winter to make wood this strong." Beatrice stopped her pen. She looked at him cautiously. "You know your timber, Your Grace?" "I know the land," Julian replied softly, his dark eyes fixed on the wood. "I know what it takes to keep a struggling estate alive. When the soil is poor and the winters are entirely unmerciful, for the next 2 days." Beatrice carefully tested him. She steered their brief, fragmented conversations toward estate management, tenant law, crop rotations. She expected the shallow, theoretical knowledge of an aristocrat, a man who only saw his lands from the comfortable back of a thoroughbred horse. But Julian's knowledge was startlingly practical. He spoke of the precise cost of winter grain. He understood the agonizing arithmetic of surviving a bad harvest. He spoke of the land, not as a source of endless passive wealth, but as a heavy, living responsibility. Beatrice listened to him, her emerald eyes narrowing in quiet confusion. This was not the smooth, polished predator she had prepared for. This was a man who had clearly spent years walking through the mud. On the third morning, a torrential Highland downpour kept the mill workers inside. The cedar-paneled office was incredibly quiet, save for the crackle of the stove and the heavy rain drumming relentlessly against the roof. Beatrice decided to push him further. She closed her ledger and pulled a worn, wooden cribbage board from the desk drawer. "Do you play, Your Grace?" she asked, gesturing to the worn deck of cards. Julian looked surprised for a moment. A duke, playing a tavern card game with a nameless female clerk. It was entirely improper. But then, a faint, genuine smile broke through his exhaustion. "I have been known to lose a few shillings in my time," he answered, pulling a wooden chair up to the desk. Beatrice dealt the cards. This was her trap, She knew exactly how proud men operated. An arrogant nobleman might tolerate a clerk, but he would never tolerate losing to one, especially a woman. She intended to beat him soundly, and watch the polite, aristocratic mask finally slip away. She waited for the condescension, the irritation, the sudden, bruised ego. She beat him 3 times in a row, decisively. Julian looked down at the final score. Beatrice held her breath, waiting for the inevitable flash of aristocratic temper. Instead, Julian leaned back in his wooden chair and let out a low, rough laugh. It was a sound completely devoid of malice or pride. It was the honest laugh of a man who was genuinely, thoroughly outmatched. "I believe," Julian said, rubbing the back of his neck with a tired smile, "that you are absolutely ruthless with those cards." "I simply pay attention to the numbers, Your Grace," Beatrice replied quietly, studying his face. Julian met her gaze, and in that quiet, unguarded moment, the flickering orange light of the stove illuminated his eyes. Beatrice felt a sudden, sharp ache in her chest, because looking at him now, with his heavy defenses lowered and his exalted title forgotten, she did not see a greedy fortune hunter. She saw a man who was drowning. She saw a profound, agonizing sadness, a quiet, devastating grief that had etched itself deep into the lines of his face. He was not here to steal her wealth for his own vanity. Whatever had driven this proud, honorable man to cross the country to sell himself to an heiress, it was breaking him from the inside out. Beatrice slowly gathered the cards. Her hands were not entirely steady. She had spent 4 years building impenetrable walls around her heart. She had designed this elaborate deception to protect herself from a villain. But as she watched the Duke of Ashbourne quietly warm his hands by the fire, Beatrice realized the terrifying truth. She had not caught a villain. She had caught a deeply good man, at the absolute worst crossroads of his life. And God help her. As the rain continued to pour outside, she found herself desperately hoping that he would return to her office the next morning. By the 6th day, Julian Vance had practically moved into the small, cedar-paneled office. He came every morning. They talked about the timber, about the intricate property laws in the Highlands, about whether English tenant farming practices could survive the harsh Scottish winters. They talked about the specific quality of the grey light falling over the dark waters of the loch. Julian had completely stopped letting her win at cribbage by the 5th day, and to his utter shock, she beat him anyway. He was no longer thinking about the wealthy Lady Beatrice Thorne, who was supposedly still away at the northern camps. He was thinking, with a quiet, increasing helplessness, about the woman who sat across the table. Beatrice, who had begun this entire elaborate deception to dissect a cold, calculating fortune hunter, was no longer studying him. She had stopped studying him days ago. She was simply present, caught in that terrifying, magnetic pull, when you find yourself somewhere you never expected to want to be, and realize you do not want to leave. But a storm was brewing inside Julian. Beatrice could feel it. It came to a breaking point on a Thursday afternoon, as the fading autumn light painted the cedar walls in long, dark shadows. Julian had been incredibly quiet for the past hour. He stood by the window, leaning his broad shoulders against the wooden frame, staring out at the freezing rain. He looked like a man standing on the very edge of a cliff, turning a heavy, jagged stone over and over in his hands. "I need to tell you something," Julian said at last. He was looking at the glass window rather than at her. Beatrice had learned by now that meant he was about to say something that cost him dearly. "It is going to sound like the statement of a man who has lost his mind," Julian continued, his voice low and tight, "and I believe it may in fact be exactly that." Beatrice set her pen down. The office was incredibly quiet. The only sound was the crackle of the iron stove. "I am listening, Your Grace." Julian closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. "I came to Ironwood to marry a fortune. You know it. I am sure everyone in this household knows it. I have crossed a country to court a woman I have never met, simply because she possesses the wealth my family desperately requires." He opened his eyes, staring out at the grey loch. "My father left Ashbourne Hall in absolute ruins," Julian said, the shame bleeding freely into his voice. "If I fail, my mother will have nowhere to live. My younger brother will be pulled from his school. My 2 young sisters will face a society that destroys women without dowries. I am the Duke. It is my duty to save them." Beatrice did not move. She did not interrupt. She simply let him bleed. I have been telling myself for weeks, Julian went on quietly, that men have done far worse for much less. And that is true. But the thing I cannot endure, the thing that sits in my chest like a stone I cannot swallow, is the lie. He finally turned away from the window. He looked directly at Beatrice. His dark eyes were completely stripped of their aristocratic pride, leaving only a raw, agonizing honesty. She will believe herself loved, Julian whispered, the horror of his own plan choking his words. Lady Thorne will go through her life with that belief, and it will not be true, and she will never know it. He took a slow, heavy breath. I will look at her every morning across the breakfast table, and I will know that I am the sole reason she is deceived. I thought of myself as a man of reasonable honor. It was the only thing I still thought well of in myself. And I came here to spend it on a lie. The cedar-paneled office fell into absolute, deafening silence. Beatrice Thorne sat perfectly still over her ledger. Because in 4 years of endless letters, forced parlor performances, and smiling gentlemen analyzing her timber yields, in 4 years of being relentlessly hunted for everything she owned, she had never once been in the presence of a man who confessed this. He was confessing to a woman he believed was absolutely nobody. That the thing he could not stomach was the deception of her, not the loss of his pride, not the inconvenience of the marriage, but the quiet, devastating tragedy of a woman who would not know she was being deceived. Beatrice had not known she was waiting to hear something like that. She had not known it was even a thing that could be said by a man. Perhaps, Beatrice said carefully, her voice trembling just a fraction, you might consider telling her the truth. Julian laughed. It was a short, worn, heartbroken sound. And lose the fortune. And my sister's futures in a single sentence? No. Absolute honesty is a luxury in my situation. I have worked out that much. And if she would prefer your honesty over your performance? Beatrice asked, her emerald eyes locking onto his. Julian smiled at her. A gentle, terribly sad smile. Then she would be a woman in 1,000, Julian said softly, and I would certainly not deserve her, but it does not signify, because I have absolutely no evidence that such a woman exists. Julian pushed off the wooden window frame. The heavy confession seemed to have drained the very last of his strength. Forgive me, he said softly. I have been appallingly rude, unburdening my darkest sins on a woman who simply came in to balance the quarterly accounts. Beatrice stared down at her ledger. Her heart was beating so violently against her ribs. She was certain he could hear it in the quiet room. She tightened her grip on her feathered pen, desperately trying to hide the slight tremble in her ink-stained fingers. I charge by the hour, Your Grace, Beatrice managed to say. Her voice was miraculously steady, a perfect mask of calm. You have had the first one for free. Julian stopped at the door. He stared at her for a long moment, and then he laughed. It was a genuine, surprised sound. A brief flash of light in the overwhelming dark. I begin to think, Julian said, a faint, warm smile finally touching his eyes, that this small, dusty office is the most honest room in the entire British Empire. He was not entirely wrong, but he was also completely, tragically mistaken. As Julian gently closed the door behind him, leaving her alone with the crackling stove, the full, crushing weight of the situation crashed down on Beatrice Thorne. She had built a flawless fortress. She had instructed her entire household to lie. She had worn the rough canvas apron and the woolen cap, specifically to expose a predator. But the man who had just walked out of that door was not a predator. He was the most fiercely honorable, deeply wounded man she had ever met. And he had just handed her his bare, bleeding heart, completely by accident. Beatrice pressed her hands against her eyes. She had spent 4 long years, desperately searching for a man who would love her for her mind and her spirit, rather than her timber and her gold. And now, miraculously, impossible as it seemed, she had found him. But she was entirely trapped in her own brilliant deception. If she stood up right now, if she ran out into the freezing mill yard and confessed that she was Lady Beatrice Thorne, what would he do? He would look back at the past 6 days. He would remember every single honest, agonizing thing he had confessed in this room. He would realize that he had bared his soul and admitted his desperate fortune hunting. to the exact woman he was planning to deceive. The profound humiliation would destroy him. A proud duke like Julian Vance would never forgive being made into a fool. He would walk away from Ironwood forever. He would let his ancestral home fall into ruin, just to preserve whatever was left of his shattered pride. The smell of pine resin and dark ink filled her senses as Beatrice let out a shaky breath. She had caught him. She had completely, unequivocally caught him. But in doing so, she had made it entirely impossible for him to stay. She loved him. The realization did not arrive like a gentle, romantic dawn. It hit her like a falling oak tree. It was heavy, sudden, and entirely undeniable. She had fallen deeply in love with a ruined aristocrat who had crossed the country to steal her fortune. And tomorrow, or the day after, the fictional Lady Thorne would have to officially return from the northern logging camps. Julian would put on his heavy velvet coats. He would build up his polished, aristocratic walls. He would step into her grand drawing room, and he would begin to lie to her. And Beatrice would have to sit there, wearing her expensive silk dresses and her inherited jewels, listening to his false, hollow compliments, knowing exactly how much that lie was tearing him apart. For the first time in her life, the brilliant, calculating heiress of Ironwood had absolutely no idea what to do. For 12 days, the cedar-paneled office at the edge of the Ironwood mill yard existed entirely outside of time. It was a quiet, dusty sanctuary, separated from the grand, imposing manor house up on the hill. Down here, among the smell of fresh sawdust and the heat of the iron stove, there were no dukes. There were no wealthy heiresses. There were only two people, quietly dismantling each other's heavy defenses. By the 11th day, Julian Vance had completely stopped fighting the inevitable. He no longer stood by the window looking out at the gray Scottish loch. He sat across the desk from Beatrice. He watched the way her dark hair escaped her wool cap. He memorized the exact, striking shade of her emerald eyes, and the way her brow furrowed when she was calculating a difficult column of numbers. He had fallen in love with her. It was a quiet, desperate, completely ruinous kind of love. It was the love of a starving man who had finally found warmth, only to realize it belonged to a fire he was strictly forbidden to touch. Beatrice felt it too. The air between them had grown incredibly thick. Every time their hands accidentally brushed over the cribbage board, the silence in the room stretched, becoming heavy with unspoken confessions. She watched him struggling. She saw the agonizing war raging behind his dark eyes, but she was entirely paralyzed by her own deception. And then, the fragile, beautiful illusion shattered. It happened on a cold Wednesday morning. Julian was crossing the grand entrance hall of the manor when Mrs. Higgins, the formidable housekeeper, stopped him. "Your Grace," the older woman said, offering a polite curtsy, "I have just received a message from the northern camps. Lady Beatrice Thorne has finished her inspections. She will return to Ironwood tomorrow evening, and will be delighted to formally receive you at dinner." Tomorrow evening. The words struck Julian like a physical blow to the chest. The borrowed time had officially run out. He nodded politely to the housekeeper, his face a perfect, impassive mask. But as soon as he reached his grand guest chamber, Julian locked the heavy wooden door and collapsed into a chair by the unlit hearth. The arithmetic of his life laid itself out before him, cold and unforgiving. Tomorrow evening, he would put on his finest velvet coat. He would walk down the grand staircase. He would meet a wealthy stranger, and he would begin the terrible, lifelong lie that would save his family from absolute ruin. Ashbourne Hall would be saved. His mother would be secure. His sisters would be safely married off. And Julian Vance would die inside. He would spend the rest of his natural life, waking up every single morning, wishing the woman across his breakfast table was a nameless, ink-stained clerk in a canvas apron. He sat in the dark, freezing room for hours. He thought about his duty. He thought about the crushing weight of his title. He thought about the generations of Vances who had commanded the Cornwall coast. And then, he thought about the sharp, emerald eyes of the woman in the mill office, who had listened to his darkest sins and had not judged him. By the time the sun began to set over the loch, Julian stood up. His face was pale, but his dark eyes were completely clear. The agonizing, suffocating war in his chest was finally over. He had made a decision. A completely insane, illogical, financially ruinous decision. but for the first time in 6 years, he felt like he could actually breathe. He did not put on his heavy coat. He walked out of the manor house in his simple wool sweater, stepping into the biting Highland wind, and marched straight down the hill toward the mill yard. The yard was empty. The workers had gone home. Only a single, faint yellow light glowed from the cedar-paneled office. Julian pushed the heavy wooden door open. Beatrice was still sitting at her desk. She looked up, startled by the sudden intrusion. But the moment she saw his face, the pen slipped entirely from her fingers. Julian did not look tired anymore. He did not look like a man carrying the weight of a ruined estate. He looked like a man who had burned his own ships and was staring at the only shore left in the world. He walked across the cedar floorboards. He did not stop at the iron stove. He walked right up to her desk, placing both of his hands firmly on the polished wood, leaning down so she was forced to look directly into his eyes. "Lady Thorne returns tomorrow," Julian said. His voice was low, vibrating with an absolute, unshakable certainty. Beatrice swallowed hard, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. "I know, Your Grace. I am not going to meet her," Julian stated, the words falling like heavy stones in the quiet room. Beatrice stared at him, the breath catching in her throat. "What do you mean?" Julian did not flinch. He did not look away. "I mean," he whispered, his eyes locked desperately onto hers, "that I am going to ruin myself, and I am going to ask you to let me do it." The cedar-paneled office was completely silent. The only sound was the harsh, ragged breathing of a man who had just thrown his entire life away. Julian Vance stood leaning over the heavy oak desk, his dark eyes locked onto Beatrice. He did not pull back. He did not blink. "I came to Scotland to marry a fortune," Julian said, his voice dropping to a rough, desperate whisper, "and I find that I simply cannot do it. Not because I am too good for it. I am clearly not too good for it. But because in the past 12 days, in this dusty room, I have done the one thing I had absolutely no earthly right to do." He reached across the ledger and gently took her ink-stained hand. His fingers were warm and incredibly firm. "I have lost myself," Julian confessed, the words tearing out of his chest, "to a woman who keeps mill accounts, a woman who beats me ruthlessly at cards, and listens to my darkest sins without turning away. I have, very inconveniently, and with my eyes completely open, fallen hopelessly in love with you." Beatrice's breath hitched. She could not speak. The heavy oak desk beneath her hands felt as though it were entirely falling away. "I know exactly what this means," Julian continued, his grip on her hand tightening. "I know exactly what it costs. My brother, my sisters, my ancestral estate. I have done the agonizing arithmetic, and I find that I simply do not care. Or rather, I care very much, but I am choosing this anyway." He stood up slightly straighter, a profound, heartbreaking dignity settling over his broad shoulders. "I would rather go back to Cornwall," Julian said, "and face the absolute ruin of my name, than spend one more day pretending I could look at someone else across a breakfast table without desperately wanting it to be you." Beatrice stared at him. Her brilliant, calculating mind had completely stopped working. Because this man, this proud, desperate English duke, who had confessed that he was drowning in debt, was now knowingly, deliberately, throwing away the very thing he had crossed the country to obtain. And he was throwing it away for a woman he believed had absolutely nothing. "Tomorrow evening," Julian said softly, "I am going to send a letter to the manor house, informing Lady Thorne that I am not free to offer her an honest heart. And then, I am going to return to this office." He took a slow, deep breath, laying his soul completely bare. "And I am going to ask you if you will have a man who came to Scotland in disgrace, and is leaving it in a different kind of disgrace. I am going to ask if you might marry me, with absolutely nothing to offer you, except a title that costs more than it yields, and the sincerest, most devoted regard I have ever had for anyone." The silence in the room was deafening. Beatrice looked down at her hand, safely enclosed in his. She had spent 4 grueling years building high, impenetrable walls. She had been building them for so long. She had begun to believe they were simply the shape of her. She had been absolutely certain that she could never, ever know if a man truly wanted her, or if he merely wanted her vast timber rights. And now, Julian Vance had just proven it. He had proven it beyond any argument either of them could possibly make, because he had chosen her. When he believed she had absolutely nothing to her name but a ledger and a coffee stove. She had to tell him. Right now. This very instant. Before he sacrificed one more thing for a poverty that did not actually exist. Julian, Beatrice whispered. She had not used his given name before. She saw his dark eyes widen slightly at the sound of it. Before you say anything more, Beatrice said, her voice shaking with a terrifying mixture of guilt and overwhelming love. There is something I have to tell you, and you are going to be very angry. And you have every right to be. Julian frowned slightly, waiting. Beatrice stood up from her wooden chair. She looked the Duke of Ashbourne directly in the eyes. I am not, Beatrice said slowly. The mill clerk. Julian looked at her with the blank, confused expression of a man who had not quite understood the words. There is no mill clerk, Beatrice continued, the truth finally breaking free. There is no lowly secretary. I am Beatrice Thorne. This is my mill. Those are my timber contracts. That is my lock. She watched his face carefully. She watched the devastating realization finally begin to dawn in his eyes. I have known who you were from the moment you stepped off the coach, Beatrice confessed. And I let you take me for an employee. And I let you sit in this office for nearly 2 weeks, saying every honest thing you had in you, thinking you were saying it to someone who could not possibly matter. The cedar-paneled office was completely silent. The only sound was the howling wind of the Scottish loch outside. Julian Vance stepped back from the heavy oak desk. He looked at her, really looked at her. As the monumental scale of the deception finally crashed over him, he went back through the past 12 days. He remembered every morning in this office, every conversation about timber and cribbage. He remembered standing by the window, confessing his darkest, most humiliating secrets. While the very woman he was confessing about sat across the desk and listened, he watched the hurt arrive in his dark eyes. It was a profound, deeply justified hurt. You came here to study a fortune hunter, Julian said, his voice dangerously quiet. And I was the specimen. Yes, Beatrice answered. She did not look away. She owed him the absolute truth. You knew. Julian continued, the betrayal hardening his features. Every single time I told you I despised what I had come here to do, you knew I was confessing it, to the exact person I had come here to do it to. Yes. And when I told you that the thing I could not stomach was the lie. Julian's voice broke slightly. You were the woman I was lying about. Yes, Beatrice said, her voice completely even. All of it, yes. I own it all. I have absolutely no defense for it, except that I was exhausted, and I was frightened. I have been deceived by so many people for so long, that I did something terribly cowardly, and I called it self-protection. She took a step toward him. He did not move. But it stopped being self-protection around the 4th morning, Beatrice whispered. And I did not know how to undo it. I kept not knowing how to undo it, until just now. When you were about to ruin yourself for a woman you believed had nothing, and I simply could not let you. Julian stared at her. The anger was still there, simmering just beneath the surface. He had been made a complete fool. You wanted to know if any of it was real, Beatrice said, her emerald eyes shining with unshed tears. Here is the only answer I have, and it is the only thing I am absolutely certain of in this entire sorry business. She reached out and gently touched his arm. He did not pull away. What you said in this room about your brother, your sisters, the estate, the lie you couldn't stomach. All of it was real, Beatrice said softly. I know it was real. Because you said it believing I could not possibly matter. You said it to absolutely nobody. Julian closed his eyes, a heavy sigh escaping his lips. And just now, Beatrice continued, her voice gaining strength, you offered to give up everything you came here for, knowingly, with the arithmetic entirely clear to you. For a woman you believed had absolutely no more to her name than a ledger and a coffee stove. She took a trembling breath. Do you understand what you have given me, Julian? I have spent 4 years, certain that I could never, ever know whether any man wanted me or my timber rights. And you have just proven it to both of us, beyond any argument either of us could ever make, because you chose me when you believed I had nothing. I was there. I watched you do it. Julian Vance was very still. The flickering light of the stove cast long shadows across his face. Then, something shifted in his expression. Not forgiveness, Not yet, but the beginning of an honest man, doing very honest arithmetic. You have, Julian said carefully, by the most roundabout, infuriating, and deceitful method imaginable, arranged it so that I cannot possibly be a fortune hunter. Yes, Beatrice whispered, because I chose you, when I believed you had nothing. Yes, and you were there. Yes, Julian looked down at her, and there was something almost wondering in his voice now, working its way through the hurt. And the woman I chose believing she had nothing turns out to be the exact woman whose fortune I came here to marry. Yes, so we are, Julian said slowly, shaking his head in disbelief. The only two people in the entirety of Britain who can be completely certain, both of us simultaneously, without any room for doubt, that we are wanted entirely for ourselves. That is the shape of it, Beatrice said. Julian was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the Highland rain moved against the dock with its low, patient sound. I am very angry, Julian said at last. I want to be perfectly honest about that. You should be. And I am also, Julian murmured, a reluctant, incredibly warm smile finally breaking through his defenses, trying very hard to stay angry, and finding that the mathematics keep getting in the way. Julian Vance crossed the cedar floor, just 3 slow steps across the warm wood, in the soft, flickering lamplight. Amid the familiar scent of sawdust and cold Highland air, he took her ink-stained hand in both of his. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had traversed a stormy ocean, arrived somewhere completely unexpected, and decided he would never, ever leave. Marry me, Julian said softly. His voice was no longer heavy with doubt or pride. It was steady, unshakable. Not for the timber rights, he whispered, a faint smile touching his dark eyes. Not for the lake frontage, not for the thousands of acres of ancient pine. Marry me, for the infuriating, sharp-minded woman who beat me at cribbage 4 times, and let me make a complete fool of myself for nearly 2 weeks, and gave me back my honesty by the most underhanded method imaginable. He squeezed her hands tightly. Marry me, Beatrice. I would have taken you without a single shilling, and we both know it now, which is the only thing that truly matters. Beatrice Thorne, who had spent 4 long years being wanted for everything except herself, who had built her formidable walls and kept her meticulous ledgers, and had told herself that certainty was a luxury she could never afford, lifted her free hand and pressed it briefly to her mouth. And then, she said yes. On one condition, Beatrice added, her emerald eyes dancing with mischief. Julian's brow arched playfully. Name it, my love. You owe me for 12 days of honest conversation, she said, a wicked little grin touching her lips. I quoted you a rate on your very first morning here, and you never paid. I run a massive timber operation, Your Grace. I do not extend credit indefinitely. Julian Vance threw his head back and laughed. It was a deep, booming, utterly joyful laugh. The kind of laugh a man gives when something he has been carrying on his shoulders for 6 agonizing years finally sets itself down. And he promised her that he would pay in full, with compound interest, for the rest of his natural life. And he meant every single word. They were married the following spring, just before the roaring log drives began on the loch. The county was utterly shocked, of course, though they really should not have been. Mrs. Higgins was not surprised in the slightest. Old Mr. Davies was asked for his formal opinion on the match and offered none, which everyone in Cornwall correctly understood to mean he thoroughly approved. Julian's younger brother successfully finished his university studies. His sisters were brilliantly dowered and happily married, and Ashbourne Hall was saved from financial ruin. Whenever anyone asked him about it, Julian always said, and meant it entirely, that he would have let his ancestral estate go without a single backward glance, just to keep the ink-stained woman in the mill office. Beatrice always replied that she knew it, which was precisely why she never had to let him go. They ran Ironwood together for the rest of their long, beautiful lives, side by side, sitting at the very same heavy oak table in the cedar-paneled office, going over the quarterly accounts by lamplight. The Duchess of Ashbourne never gave up her canvas apron or her practical woolen cap. She kept her habit of being found out in the mill yard, with ink smudged across her fingers and a massive ledger tucked firmly under her arm. In the years that followed, arrogant young merchants and credentialed gentlemen were forever wandering into the Ironwood yard. They would invariably mistake her for a humble clerk, and approach her with their best drawing-room manners, politely asking to be announced to the great lady of the estate. And every single time, Beatrice would calmly set down her pen, look at them with those steady, piercing emerald eyes, and inform them with a pleasant smile that she would see to it directly. She found it funnier, every single time. And the heavy, leather-bound ledger she had been balancing on the dock that freezing October morning, the one she had closed and tucked under her arm to finish in the office, was kept forever on the cedar shelf directly above the stove. Its fragile pages remained permanently marked at the exact column where her pencil had stopped moving. On the morning, a tired, hopelessly honest man had told her, believing she could not possibly matter, that the thing he could not stomach was the lie. It was, as Beatrice liked to remind her husband with a knowing smile, the most productive morning of accounts she had ever failed to finish.